Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Talking Tudors. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'd like to start by acknowledging and thanking the generous listeners who continue to support Talking Tudors on Patreon and extend a heartfelt thank you to everyone who's taken the time to rate and review the show. As an independent podcaster, this means a lot to me. If you love the podcast, if you never miss an episode, I ask you to consider joining the Talking Tudors Patreon community. Visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. If you're watching this on YouTube, just click on the link below. Once you sign up, you'll have access to exclusive posts, additional monthly live talks, a member-only book club, patron-only monthly giveaways, to name just a few of the rewards. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Joanne Paul back to the show to talk about her new biography of Thomas More. Dr. Joanne Paul is an award-winning historian, consultant, and writer with a passion for sharing her research on Renaissance and Tudor history. She's consulted for television with TLC and Amazon and appeared on a variety of programs, including for BBC, Channel 5, and TLC. Having written for academic and student audiences on Thomas More and councillors of the Tudor court, her first trade book, The House of Dudley, was a bestseller and named Book of 2022 by The Times, The Sunday Times, The Daily Telegraph, and History Today. Her latest book is Thomas More, A Life and Death in Tudor England. Let's dive straight into our conversation. Welcome back to Talking Tudors, Joanne. How are you?
I'm all right. Thank you for having me back on.
It's so lovely to have you back on the show. It's been a little while. So, would you mind just
Hmm.
introducing yourself to our listeners and our viewers and just telling us a little bit about you and your background?
Sure. My name is Dr. Joanne Paul. I'm a historian largely of the Renaissance and early modern periods. I focus a lot on Tudor and Stuart history, particularly political, cultural, intellectual history. I live in the UK, but I am Canadian, if you're wondering about the accents. My first trade book, I've got a couple of academic books, but my first trade book, my first sort of popular history was called The House of Dudley. It came out a few years ago. It's behind me there for those who are looking at the video. And it was an epic tale over three generations of this family, this scandalous family in the Tudor period, and written in a very narrative style. And my latest book, which came out in the UK 3 weeks ago, I think, and is coming out in North America in a week's time, is a biography of Thomas More.
Fabulous. And we are here to talk about this new book. And if you're watching us on YouTube, you can see it just behind Joanne there. Fabulous cover. So you have actually written about Thomas More before. So what made you return to his life? Or is it just you just never left it?
It feels a little bit like that. I do feel like I have been working on Thomas More for well over a decade now, though I have come as sort of back and forth
Yeah.
with him. So I wrote a short book on his thought in 2000, came out in 2016, 2017. And that came about because I'd worked on him a bit for my PhD. And a friend of mine had started working for this publisher, Polity. They needed someone to write on Thomas More. He suggested me. And I kind of went, I mean, I know a lot about him. I find him very interesting, but he's very controversial. And I don't know if
Yeah.
I want to get into that. But the fact that it was just about his thought, and I was trained as an intellectual historian, so history of ideas, I thought, okay, no problem. So I wrote that. And that coincided with the quincentenary of Utopia coming out, 1516 to 2016. And so I ended up doing a lot of press and talks and everything else around Thomas More. And people kept asking, oh, what biography would you recommend? And I think most people will know this. There isn't one that you can recommend out there, except for maybe now, that you can recommend without qualification, because they all come from a very specific time and place and are all sort of making a particular kind of argument. I think the exception would be Peter Ackroyd's 1999 uh, biography, but that is more narrative than it is historical. I mean, Peter Ackroyd is a fantastic writer, but he's not a Tudor historian specifically. And so finally, it lodged in my brain that maybe it was time for a new biography. Peter Ackroyd's was the most recent, and that's more than 25 years ago now. And maybe I should write it. And I'm one of those people, if I see something that needs doing,
Yeah.
I'll tend to do it myself. And so I kind of convinced myself into, yeah, I'd better do this, even though he's a very controversial figure. And then as I started working on the proposal and the pitch and everything else, I did get really excited
Mhm.
about it. And writing it was a real journey, a creative journey, a self-reflective journey. And so I'm really, really pleased that I did come round to the idea.
Yeah, just out of curiosity, so did your ideas about him or your thoughts about him evolve quite a bit from sort of the early days of you working on Thomas More and now after finishing this monumental biography?
I think so, because I think, like everyone else, I had read those previously existing biographies that tend to fall into the two camps of he's this wonderful saintly scholar, sort of unimpeachable, or he's this hardened, stubborn zealot and persecutor and torturer and murderer, even. And I wasn't sure which I camp I fell into, but knew it must be one of those two. And as I started working on him, I gained a real appreciation for his ideas, for his thought, for his central beliefs. But as I worked on this biography as well, I really started to understand the complex individual underneath all of this. And I think it brought home for me the way in which we are all very complex individuals, that history can do all sorts of things with our legacies. It almost becomes just in the same way that I think social media and the fact that the world is watching us now, little statements can turn us into heroes or villains.
Mm.
And the way in which we perceive each other can become very polarized. And I think that's true looking at the past as well. And so working on Thomas More helped me appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure that many of our listeners, if they've been immersed in the world of Tudor history for a little while, have heard quite a bit about Thomas More, of course,
Mm,
but maybe not so much his early life. So can you tell us a little bit
yeah.
about his family and sort of the early years?
Thomas More, I think there's often a perception that he's born with a bit of a silver spoon in his mouth. That he comes at the very least from money, even though he's not noble. That's not quite right. He's born in an area called Cripplegate Without, which is just north of the London Wall in 1478. This is not a poverty-stricken neighborhood by any stretch, but it's not the very fashionable, um, very wealthy area near Cheapside where we originally thought he had been born. His father is a young lawyer. Um, we know that he'll eventually have quite an exciting career, but nobody knew that in 1478. And he's actually the orphan son of a baker. So he's first generation to that trade. Some of Thomas More's grandparents and other ancestors did fairly well, but in a very sort of neighborhood way. They were counselors. They were um, had roles within their guilds or fraternities. And, the sense of community, these small overlapping communities, I think was very important to Thomas More growing up, and it's something that he tries to defend later in life. He had a number of siblings, many of whom died quite young. So the presence of death, as it was for so many in this time, was certainly there for Thomas More. And he also grew up during the Wars of the Roses. So he was born under Edward IV in what we now know was a bit of a lull in the Wars
Yeah.
of the Roses. But he was 5 in 1483, the year of Three Kings. And he was 7 when Henry VII invaded and took the throne. And he writes about that period later on. He writes his history of King Richard III, in which he reflects on those years. And I think the presence of the the threat of civil war is something that remains very much in Thomas More's mind as he gets older, as it does indeed for Henry VIII as well. That fear of falling back into the Wars of the Roses, because we know that it ends. Well, this debate about what year, we know that it ends. They didn't,
Mm-hmm.
and at any one of these reigns could have just been a blip, a lull. And so I think all of those things really impact on Thomas More's thinking later in life.
And so when does his political career begin? And especially when does he come to the attention of Henry VIII?
Thomas More benefits from an excellent education and amazing connections. So he's able to attend the only free grammar school in London at the time. I think his parents couldn't have afforded to send him anywhere fee paying. So he's very lucky to do that. And then through his father's connections, he ends up at Lambeth Palace in the home of the Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Chancellor, the position that More will later take himself, Cardinal Morton. Morton then secures him a place at Oxford, where he is for 2 years before returning to London and training in the law at the Inns of Court. His connections, his London connections, are really important in the early part of his career. He's made a freeman of the Mercers Company, which allows him to hold positions in London city government, which he does. He becomes an MP, he becomes Under Sheriff of London. And it's on behalf of the Mercers that he starts negotiating and getting involved in trade disputes. This eventually sends him on a very historic and very important for him trade mission to the Low Countries, which is where he writes Utopia, his best known text, and also where he first attracts the attention of Wolsey and of the king. They were aware of him, but I think this really cements it because it's not long after that that he's sworn in as a king's counselor.
Is that quite early on in Henry's reign, as in Henry VIII?
Yeah. So he's sworn in as counselor by March 1518.
Okay.
So yes, I mean
Yeah.
Henry VIII is established.
Hmm.
More has encountered him a few times at this point. He met him as a child in 1499, so Henry VIII was 8 or 9. He was the second son at that point, not that important. Prince Arthur had his own court elsewhere. So he meets him then. Thomas More is at the coronation, at least the procession. I don't think he's at the actual event at Westminster, but he's at the procession through London and writes a coronation ode, which he presents to Henry VIII. And Henry VIII might have sort of been aware of him in a few other legal cases up to that point. But I think when Thomas More really understands what Henry VIII is like, is in this event that I detail in the book called the Evil May Day riots, which is xenophobic riots against strangers or foreigners in London. That I mean, there's very little violence, very little property damage, but Henry VIII comes down very hard and literally slaughters teenagers. We would think of them as children in the streets of London. And I think that shifts things a little bit for More in terms of where he can actually do the most good, because the London city government is absolutely powerless against what the king and court decide to do.
So, what is his relationship like with the king? Obviously, we know this gets extremely tense. But how does it evolve?
We tend to see them as friends. I think, Man for All Seasons and other
Yes.
portrayals. His son-in-law talks about them walking sort of arm in arm in the garden.
Mm.
Actually, I think he describes Henry VIII as having his arm around More's neck, which I think is very specific
Yes.
and meant to evoke something for us. But they weren't friends. More was a servant. He was a counselor. Its main role was as a go-between for Henry VIII and for his right-hand man, or the other king, as he was known, the Alter Rex, Cardinal Wolsey, because Wolsey tended to be camped out at Hampton Court, and Henry VIII was moving around his various palaces and hunting and everything else, and Thomas More would be a go-between for them. We have this great description of a day in the life of Thomas More that I was able to piece together from some of his letters to Wolsey. And basically, he'd be there first thing in the morning with a pile of papers, trying to convince the king to read them, to sign a few things, to engage. And Henry VIII literally laughs at him and says, "No, no, I'll do the rest tonight. Leave me alone." And so Thomas More has to travel with the court and carry all these papers, and finally gets to see him again after dinner, where he signs a few more and then says, "Okay, I'm done. I'm tired. Go away." And then Thomas More is called back in because there's a new urgent letter. So he finds the king in the Queen's chambers. Again, they talk about this for ages. It's now past midnight. Finally is able to go to bed, does the whole thing the next day, and he's writing letters to Wolsey so early in the morning that he can't get a messenger to send them, because he's just working through the night. So this is the sort of relationship they have, which is he's very subject to the king's will and indeed whims when it comes to his working life.
That's exhausting. I'm just exhausted thinking about that.
Yeah.
And that's quite common, isn't it, for Henry's sort of top ministers? I'm just thinking
Yeah.
Cromwell, who basically I don't think Cromwell
Yeah.
slept, to be honest.
Mm.
It's amazing. Yeah, wow, really exhausting. And so, and let's talk a little bit about Thomas's religious beliefs and how these
Mm.
changed over time.
Yeah, I think fundamentally, I don't think they did change much.
Mhm.
I think it's a matter of emphasis.
Yeah.
So in the early part of his life, so let's say before 1520 and the Reformation, what we now know as the Reformation really kicks off, especially in England. He is a religious reformer. So he's a social critic. Like his friend Erasmus, he's sort of critical of everyone, especially if they've got power and money, and that includes the church. He is especially, I think, critical of the wealth of the church. I think he uh, is throughout his life not convinced by the supremacy of the Pope. I think he has we might think about it as a sort of democratic. I think a more accurate term was sort of Republican view of the church, where it's the people that make up the church. That is the church, is the authority of the church, is the source of all of its authority, not one guy at the top. And he felt the same about politics
Yeah.
as well. So he is critical of the church and of all authority, really. And he's especially questioning of the artificialities of life. So those made up things that are so important to society then as now money, right? Totally made up.
Yeah.
Property, social status, right? All of these things and the symbols that accompany them, a crown. How does that make you better than me, right?
Mm.
These sorts of things. He wants us to question them. When the Reformation happens, he he shifts slightly. He still holds the same beliefs, but he's now more worried about the people who question authority than he is about the people who have authority.
Mhm.
Um, and and his central concerns remain the same, which is a sense of community, which is a concern about pride. He's just more concerned that the people who are questioning authority have the pride and are more of a threat to society and community than the people who have authority. And so it's the context around him that shifts. But his central beliefs do remain essentially the same, which is a sort of reformist Catholic view. He's such a reformer, in fact, that when Luther and his followers are sort of getting going, they expect more to go along with them.
Right.
um, I think there's a sense of betrayal, and that persists over the centuries. Historians like David Hume writing much later, are also going, really, he should have been a Protestant. um,
Wow.
but he isn't. He remains an ardent Catholic.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I think people will find that really fascinating. And already he's emerging as a much more nuanced person,
Mm.
which is really interesting. So thank you. I was just also wondering about how he's perceived by his contemporaries. Obviously, you've noted his beginnings, and he's not a nobleman, and class is everything at the Tudor court. So how do they view him?
I think he was viewed in the same way that a lot of the so-called new men were. So this was the brainchild of Henry VII. It's a brilliant strategy that he elevated talented administrators, often lawyers, often from very low social backgrounds, to very high positions. And this did a number of things. One, it increased the efficiency of the bureaucracy around the crown, because they were better at these things than nobles were.
Hmm.
Nobles tended to be lazy and not necessarily that bright. Whereas these, were sort of go-getters, if you
Hmm.
want to think about it that way, and highly trained, and very well educated. It also meant that they owed everything to the crown. Uh, they were completely dispensable, and it peeved off the nobles, so they had someone to hate that
Hmm.
wasn't the king. So it was a brilliant strategy, and Henry VIII continues this. If you look at people like Wolsey, Cromwell, Cranmer,
Hmm.
More, all named Thomas. These are
Yes.
all new men in that sense. So I think he was viewed in that same way as a very capable administrator. He becomes secretary to the king before he becomes Lord Chancellor. He's under treasurer, but I think he's also viewed as very expendable.
Right.
And so when he does become Lord Chancellor, I think it's a recognition of his skills,
Hmm.
but it's also this sense of, if he becomes a problem, we can get rid of him. The Lord Chancellor before him, as I'm sure many of your listeners know, was Thomas Wolsey, Cardinal Wolsey, who himself wasn't landed gentry, but was a cleric. And he had the church behind him, and he had all these church offices and these resources. And so when he falls, it's a very big deal.
Mm.
When More falls, people are upset about it, but it's not. He doesn't have the resources to fight it. He's not very important, and he certainly doesn't have an army
No.
at his back like some of the
Mm.
nobles would. Nor is it that big of a deal in the church.
Mm.
So I think he has the respect of a lot of people. I think a lot of people do like him. Uh, but like so many others, he's he's good at what he does, but ultimately disposable.
Mm. And Thomas, of course, was a family man as well. So tell us a
Mm.
little bit about what he was like as husband and father as well.
From all the evidence we have, and this is the bit from his legacy, his sort of mythologizing, that I can go, yeah, that's pretty right. He seems to have been a very loving family
Mm.
man. He marries twice. His first wife dies fairly young, um, after giving birth to their four children, uh, three daughters and a son. And he writes a beautiful, sort of eulogizing epitaph to her, talking about um, how she was the wife of his youth, and gave him these wonderful children, and then his sadness at her passing. What's controversial then as now is that he remarries very, 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 very quickly, within weeks of her funeral, and has to get a sort of pay for a special dispensation to be able to do this. And this has been read all sorts of different ways. But I think fundamentally, at that point, he had four children under the age of 5 or 6. He had several jobs.
Mm.
He was also a scholar. He did a lot going on. And I think he needed someone to manage his household and raise his children. And he had someone who was probably a friend, who had also just lost her husband. And they married very quickly. And that second marriage to Alice was also very, very successful. His friends loved Alice. They always sort of send her kisses and things. And Erasmus describes her as having excellent mother wit, that she's a wonderful household manager, and has this skill and this intelligence when it comes to being a mother within the household. And they engage in some lovely banter, Alice and Thomas, that is recorded in the letters as well. Uh, he adores his children. I think there's no question about that. He educates his daughters alongside his son, which was seen as very surprising, controversial, even scandalous. Erasmus is initially against it, but says he becomes convinced that women can be educated in this way, thanks to the Moore girls. They dispute in front of the king, and everyone comes along for this spectacle of, oh my God, these women are disputing. They're able to do that. Wow. And he convinces apparently a lot of noblemen to educate their daughters as well. There's a great moment in a letter where Erasmus is describing a conversation he has with Thomas More, and he says, "But if the worst should happen, if the girls should die, won't you feel that all of that resource has been wasted, right? All that time you spent educating them, and they just die."
Mm.
And Thomas More responds, "Well, I'd rather they die educated than uneducated."
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's just the great way of cutting through, what is essentially a horrible
Yeah.
question. Um, the disposability of women's lives, but then the resources will have been wasted. I never asked that question about a boy, of course.
Mm.
And Thomas More just cuts through it. I'd rather they die educated. So I think we can get behind that perception of More as a very dedicated, loving family man, and his when he is, and I'm giving the plot away a bit here, when he is imprisoned in the tower, most of his letters go to his eldest daughter Margaret, who is allowed to visit him, and his last letter indeed is to Margaret and to the family.
Yeah, I think that side of him is often portrayed in some obviously series and films and things like that. Quite touching scenes of Moore and his family,
Mm.
which is interesting. But I think we need to touch on Joanne, the fact that you mentioned he's a very controversial figure. He is a very divisive figure, as you've said. If you kind of post
Yeah.
about him online, you will get the one, people that love him, people that absolutely hate him. Many people, of course, condemn him for his persecution of quote unquote heretics. So, what are your thoughts on this? How did you kind of tackle this in your work?
When it came to Thomas More, and writing a biography of Thomas More, my intention really was to treat him as I'd treat any other historical figure, and to try to set aside as much as possible anything posthumous. So I do use them when I can verify them,
Yeah.
or when I can sort of caveat that I'm using them. But I wanted to get at the sources that we have.
Hmm.
Um, Now, it won't surprise you to know that brings up a lot of ambiguity. The sources don't tend to tell us one thing or another. They tend to leave a lot open. But that's the art of history, and that's just the reality of it. Certainly, More was in favor of the persecution, the prosecution, as he would see it, of those known as heretics. It was the law, and he um, felt very strongly that heresy would lead to violence and potentially the breakdown of society. He saw the a theology of Lutheranism with its denial of the importance of good works to salvation. It was by faith alone, as well as the denial of free will. He saw that as directly connected to some of the atrocities of his age, including the German Peasants' War and the sack of Rome. And he thought that there was a direct line between this way of thinking this theology and this way of being in the world, and it made him very afraid. And it's a trope now that, of course, it's fear that leads to
Yeah,
hatred and violence, and it
absolutely.
did for Thomas More. And so he begins writing against heresy and Lutheranism on behalf of Henry VIII, really. And he starts out. We have an account of him leading a raid on what's known as the Steelyard in London to collect smuggled books that are brought in from the continent, written by Luther or his followers, men like Tyndale, etc. And so he's participating in this prosecution of heretical texts, where it gets sort of amped up to the next level is when he becomes Lord Chancellor, is when we see the first Lutherans being executed, burned at the stake. There are three that occur essentially within More's not quite remit, because he actually has no official role in any of this, but within his awareness, I suppose, in London. And he has direct contact with all three of them. So he does imprison suspected heretics in his gatehouse in Chelsea, where he keeps a set of stocks. That in itself is not that unusual that he keeps a set of stocks. He would be expected to keep the peace in his own area, and does so in cases that aren't directly related to heresy as well. But he imprisons them, and in his words, honestly entreats them to recant. Even at the time, there were accusations that he was engaging in torture.
Mm.
He denies these. That's where the historical record leaves us. Um, I think, from my own part, he's a very legally minded person, and I would be surprised if he engaged in something as legally dubious as torture. However, it may have happened,
Mhm.
and there are accusations at the time. So I think we leave that there. He then would hand them over to the church and secular authorities, who were in charge of trying and then punishing
Mhm.
these men. He had no role in that whatsoever. So the suggestion that, which I've seen a lot online, as you say, that he had a torture chamber in his basement, I think goes too far. um, and the suggestion that he was literally lighting the fires, lighting people on fire, also has
Mhm.
no bearing. Has no there's nothing in the historical record that would suggest that. We don't even know if he attended. He may have done.
Mm.
Um, he certainly thought it was right, though, that they were burned, and he talks about each of these men being well and worthily burned at Smithfield. So there's a lot of complexity
Mm.
there to unpack, and certainly he thought that getting rid of the contagion, as he saw it, of heresy by these means was the right thing. And he even at one point criticizes church authorities for not going further, for not putting to death more men, because he thought it would curtail more violence later down the line.
Yeah, gosh, confronting stuff that I think is so important to, as you say, look at the contemporary sources rather than read this story backwards, as so often happens with the Tudors, I think. So, in terms of his downfall, we know that, of course, this story ends on a scaffold for More. So, what ultimately leads to his downfall? Because I think there is a bit of confusion as to why Henry actually has him executed in the end.
Yeah, I recently wrote a chapter on this because there is a lot of confusion between the act of succession and the act
Hmm.
of supremacy, and the
Exactly.
oath of succession and the oath of supremacy, and what it is that Thomas More does or doesn't do,
Yeah. Yeah.
that leads to him being sentenced to death. And I think this confusion comes about in a lot of ways. because they were confused at the time. All of this happened so quickly. It's
Mm.
very slapdash, that they go, okay, well, we've got to secure the new succession, which is through Queen Anne Boleyn and her daughter Elizabeth. But that really only holds water if we recognize that Henry is the head of the church in England and not the Pope. And so, okay, so we need a preamble to the act of succession saying that he's supreme head of the church. And we want everyone to swear to the succession. Oh, but they should also probably swear to that preamble. And then
Yes.
it actually eventually shifts into a question of the supremacy
Mm.
over the succession. When it comes to Thomas More, he was happy, not happy. He would have sworn to the succession. I'm not sure he was thrilled about it, but he would have done.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's because he, again, very legally minded. For him, Parliament had every right to decide the succession.
Hmm.
The Parliament could decide the new king if they wanted to. In Thomas More's view, they were legally able to do that. That wasn't a problem. Whether or not he felt that was the right choice, not doesn't even really come into it for him. I don't think he did. But Parliament had made it law, and they had the right to make it law, so it was law, and so he would swear to that. He didn't think that Parliament had the jurisdiction to make Henry, a layman, head of the church in England. He didn't think they had the jurisdiction to decide something that affected the whole of Christendom. And so that was not something that he felt that he could swear to.
Mm.
And so by combining these two things, they made it almost impossible for Thomas More to sign to what was the succession, but hadn't also
Yeah,
involved this
yeah.
element of the supremacy. And in fact, right after he's arrested and imprisoned, Thomas Cranmer writes a letter to Cromwell saying, we could just ask him to swear just to the succession, and I
Hmm.
think he'd do it. And that would be a major win. And Cromwell takes this to the king, and the king explodes and says, absolutely not. We can't let him get away with that because these two things were so intertwined,
Yeah.
at least certainly in the mind of Henry VIII. And so they don't let him do that. But Cranmer tries. And eventually, it becomes more about the supremacy. And so in November of 1534, More had been imprisoned in April. Um, there's a new Treasons Act
Hmm.
passed, which makes denial of any of the king's titles, including head of the church, treason. And it's this Treasons Act that catches More out
Hmm.
eventually, uh, because in refusing to acknowledge, and then through the manipulation of a conversation he has with Richard Rich,
Mm.
um, what could be argued to be a denial. Um, he's considered to be a traitor, and everyone at the time knows how far that is from the original conception of what treason is, which is really an attempt on the monarch's life. This is, of course, not that at all. But Henry and his ministers have shifted the
Yeah.
definition of treason in largely specifically to get at More and a few other people
Hmm.
who are denying the supremacy, or at least refusing to publicly acknowledge it.
Yeah. So he is imprisoned for quite a long period, isn't he? Am I sort of right in thinking that there was quite a significant effort made to kind of get him to agree to everything that I'm thinking of all the other Thomases that go and visit him
Yes.
in prison. Is that what they're there for, genuinely to convince him to agree? Are they trying to save his life, basically, is what I'm asking.
That's an interesting question. So yes, he's imprisoned in April 1534 and executed in July 1535. So well
Yeah.
over a year he's imprisoned. He is interrogated a number of times, and the first sort of wave of them is most definitely to try to convince him to take the oath, convince him to agree. Later on, towards his trial, they're really just gathering evidence,
Right.
and
Yeah.
particularly for John Fisher's trial. But at the beginning, it's definitely trying to convince him. The question is, are they earnestly trying to save his life? I mean, I think that's very similar to more trying to convince heretics to recant,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
There is a way in which, yes, they're trying to save his life, but I think it's more to do with compliance,
Hmm.
and an outward performance of compliance,
Hmm.
right? I mean, I think Henry would definitely prefer more to get in line than to die.
Yeah.
Um, but that might be more to do with optics than any concern about Thomas More's own
Thomas More.
life.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so in a way, yes.
Hmm.
Uh, in terms of how any of them personally feel about it, I mean, I think Cranmer wants him to live. I think that's why
Yeah.
he writes that letter. He sort of adds, "Oh, it would be good for PR. We might get Mary on, to
Hmm.
get in line as well if More gets in line." But I think he is trying to save him. I have no idea how Cromwell feels about it. Um, I think he just executes the king's will,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
the king wants Thomas More to swear, or to suffer. So it's difficult to say what their real motives
Mm.
are. I think Henry's are quite clear, though.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And it's such a complex situation, obviously, as you've noted already with all the legislation. And I think sometimes painted a little bit too simplistically at times. So I'm interested in knowing your thoughts around, if we know, More's sort of feelings and loyalty towards Catherine of Aragon, because of course he's
Mm.
often brought up as an example of one of her most loyal subjects. And sometimes people, of course, confusingly say that he dies for his loyalty towards, to Catherine. And you've just explained that it's obviously very complex and different to that. But did you come across anything in terms of how he feels about
Mm.
Catherine, how he feels about Anne being queen now?
Mm. He adores Catherine. I think there's no question about that. He all the way back in 1501, he's writing about her entry into London, to
Yeah.
marry Prince Arthur, and he's praising her. Then he praises her again, at the coronation, after she's married to Henry VIII. And I think he really, really admires
Hmm.
her. In as these things always are, they're caught up in sort of European geopolitics, and in general, I think More is more of a friend to the Spanish and to the imperial cause than he is to the French. Um, and there are a lot of reports during the King's Great Matter, that he is very much a part of that circle
Hmm.
around Catherine. Not as explicitly as someone like Fisher, who of course acts in her defense, um, during the hearing, over the marriage. Um, he's sort of more subtle than that, but he appears to very much be a part of that. At least Eustace Chapuis thinks so.
Yeah.
We know that because of all of his letters. And More certainly wants to distance himself for that. I think he thinks he can be more helpful, if he's not explicitly, a part of Catherine's defense. If he can sit in a bit of a middle ground, I think he thinks that he can argue her case, and certainly that's what he tells Chapuis. At one point, Chapuis writes a letter to Charles V, saying that, Thomas More is his greatest supporter. He even calls him, the emperor's greatest servant in England. And so Charles writes a letter to More thanking him for being such a great servant to him. And Chapuis makes multiple attempts to deliver this letter to Thomas More, and Thomas More sort of avoids him awkwardly in the halls, until Chapuis can finally, I think, shows up at his house in Chelsea. And More says, "Do not hand me that letter. Right? As soon as you give me that letter, I have to read it, and then I have to deliver it to the king. And I have to tell the king that this is what Charles has said about me. And then the king will never trust me again. I won't be able to have his ear as I have it now, because he will see me as a servant of the emperor, which is never going to be good."
No.
Um, and so More refuses to accept this letter. Um, and Chapuis dutifully writes this to Charles, which is how we know about this episode. So I think he's definitely a supporter of
Hmm.
Catherine, but doesn't want to appear that way too much. We don't have any record of him saying anything to do with Anne Boleyn. I don't. I suspect he didn't like her. I suspect he agreed with all the things that people like Chapuis and others were saying, um, but he never says anything about it. We don't have a record of him attending the coronation, but he had no official post at that point, so wouldn't have necessarily been required to. Uh, and again, as soon as it's legitimated by Parliament, he's on board. He says, "Fine, that
Yeah.
is the law."
Yeah.
And he is nothing. If nothing else, he's generally speaking law abiding.
Mm.
If he thinks the law is just and defensible, which he would take this to be.
And so what are some important lessons that you think we can learn from his life and his career as well that maybe we can apply today?
Mm, there's quite a few. I'll try to just focus on one or two. One I've mentioned a few times is the importance of community to
Yeah.
Thomas More. He writes often about the importance of the common good or the public good over and above individual good,
Mhm.
and this idea of pride, which for him, um, I mean, there's a very positive view of pride we have today. It is Pride Month, but this to him is this idea of a sort of it's more of a competitive feeling. This idea of only being happy if you are seen to be better than everyone else, right? This kind of pride, and he sees that as necessarily cutting across the bonds that are supposed to unite us, which come really from a recognition of our own equality and our mortality. That we're all in this together, and we all contribute something to it. This kind of pride he sees as very as fundamentally dangerous
Mhm.
to the community, and he sees this in Henry VIII. He sees this in the Lutherans who think that they know better than the whole of the church. They interpret scripture themselves, um, and so I think there is something there about this early critique of a sort of very modern kind of individualism. And obviously, there's been a lot of good that has come from individualism and this idea that we want to think about our own identity and place in the world. But I think we can also say that we maybe lost something
Mhm.
by being too focused on us, ourselves,
Yes. Yeah.
as individuals. And I think we're starting to return now to a sense of community and common good and
Yes.
pitching
Yeah.
in and what we hold together as a commonality. What is common between us.
Mhm.
Even when we look at something like the climate crisis, this idea of thinking about common land, right? And what brings us together, and that we're all facing this as a community. So I think there's something there. The other thing that I would say is that I finished writing this book and wrote the address to the reader in November 2024, which as I finished it up over the summer, I became increasingly aware of uh, a return to tyranny in certain parts of the world. And I wouldn't be the first to draw attention to a parallel between Henry VIII and certain world leaders
Mhm.
today. And in Thomas More, we have someone who called out tyranny. I mean, tyranny is very close to pride, his view of pride, this self-interest, this willingness to be led by one's own wills and passions as opposed to the good of all. And he called that out. He spoke truth to this tyranny, to this power, and he was willing to suffer the consequences for so doing. And I think in our world today, with the return of very Tudor-esque tyrants,
Tudor.
this example is worth paying attention to.
Mm. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I'm sure that everybody listening now wants to get their hands on that absolutely important, intelligent book sitting right behind you. So, where can they go? And is it available worldwide at the moment?
It's certainly available in the UK. It's about to
Hmm.
be available in North
North
America.
America.
I know that there are places like Blackwell's in the UK and others that do fairly inexpensive
Yes.
international shipping. So there are ways of getting hold of it. I don't know too in terms of the Audible or Kindle versions.
Hmm.
Hopefully those will be accessible soon as well. The Audible is read by Ben Miles, who
Ooh.
is a fantastic actor. He was in The Crown, for instance. He was recently in Andor, and he portrayed Thomas Cromwell in Wolf Hall on stage. So he really, really knows this period, and I was so honored that he agreed to read it for the audiobook.
Oh, that is so exciting. And I can absolutely highly recommend Blackwell's for anyone that's outside of the UK. I use them all the time, so I don't have to wait for, certain release dates and all of that. So absolutely wonderful. But I have one more thing to ask you, and that
Mm.
is the Tudor takeaway that I do ask all my guests. So
Right.
this is just something for our listeners to go off and explore after the episode, maybe something connected to more, maybe something else. Do you have a takeaway for us?
Well, I was recently invited to rewatch the personal life of Henry VIII, which is the Charles Laughton
Ah,
film
yes.
from, oh, is it 1933 or something like that's very early. Um, and I'd watched it as a child, and I think I hadn't got it
Hmm.
then. And I rewatched it, and I mean, Thomas More, I don't, maybe he appears for like a sec. I don't think he's really in it. Cromwell is, but I think it's a wonderful take on Henry VIII because he is childlike and petulant
Hmm.
and laughable. There's something really pathetic about him, but also a sort of cunning. Um, and what I really loved about it is it's really a woman's world, and he's just kind of bouncing around in it. And I think it's when you compare it to later portrayals, I actually think this one gets it. And I think I do encourage people to laugh at the patheticness of Henry VIII, and that's not to disacknowledge his cruelty,
Hmm.
um, but um, I think we have to laugh at tyrants because they are pathetic, and
Hmm.
that's the thing that they hate most.
Yeah,
And so I think,
exactly.
even at a distance of 500 years, we have to do that. So I think the private life, I guess the personal life, the private
Private
life
Life of Henry
of
VIII.
Henry VIII with Charles Laughton.
Oh, fantastic takeaway. I love it. And thank you so much, Joanne, for taking the time to come back onto the podcast and talk tutors with us.
Thank you.